Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Castelli, and I'm the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. This evening's event is the second in a series of events organized around ideas of art and political imagination, the theme for our 46th annual Scholar and Feminist Conference, this year organized as an unconference featuring several events scheduled over the next month. In this series, we're interested in exploring the ways in which art functions as a medium for political expression, a platform for working out political ideas, and as an effective mode for expressions of anger and hope, lamentation, and consolation. Please visit BCRW's website for the rest of the events in this series, including a virtual gathering to honor the work and memory of June Jordan on April 1st, 2 artist talks and a discussion between visual artist Sherazad Garcia and Nadir Surji with our Barnard colleague Kayama Glover on April 5th, and a live-streamed concert by Grammy Award winner and MacArthur Fellow Rhiannon Giddens on April 16th. All events are free and open to the public. As always, I want to express my deep gratitude to everyone at BCRW for their work on this event and the conference as a whole. Avi Cummings, Pam Phillips, Tammy Navarro, Hope Dector, Eve Kausch, and tonight's our BCRW student research assistant, Tirza Anderson. This evening's ASL interpreters are Gregorio Nieto and Nora Joy Rodriguez from Body Language Productions. The captioner is Caitlin Maury from Total Caption, and the captions are available in the chat on YouTube. I'm especially honored to welcome this evening's speaker to our virtual stage. Professor Nicole Fleetwood is the author of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in the field of criticism, to be awarded next week. Marking Time was also selected as a Best Art Book of 2020 by the New York Times, by Art News, and by Art Newspaper. This book is available for purchase from our bookselling partners, Word Up Community Bookshop in Washington Heights. You can find the URL for their online shop in the chat. Professor Fleetwood is also the curator of a current exhibition entitled Marking Time, on view at MoMA PS1 through April 4th, 2021. This exhibition is obviously based on the book Marking Time. She is the author of 2 other important books of criticism, On Racial Icons, Blackness, and the Public Imagination, and Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. She is also co-editor of Aperture Magazine's Prison Nation issue, focusing on photography's role in documenting mass incarceration, and the co-curator of the magazine's touring exhibition of the same name. She has curated and co-curated exhibitions and programs on art and mass incarceration around the country, and she's received many prestigious national and international grants and fellowships. She is professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. The title of her talk this evening is Visions of Abolition: Black Women's Fight to End Mass Incarceration. After her formal presentation, there will be time for questions from the audience, which you can convey via the chat function on YouTube. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fleetwood to Virtual Barnard.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that warm welcome. And it's really an honor to be here and participate in the 46th annual conference. I'm deeply, it means a lot for me to be included. And so thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm going to talk tonight about art and abolition, especially art made by Black women artists, activists, and also people who are directly impacted and loved ones of people who are directly impacted. And I'm going to do my talk by sharing images with you. I like to speak from images. So I'm going to share my screen. So just give me 1 second while I pull up my presentation. And as Dr. Castelli said, this talk is based on research that I've done for the past 10 years that has led to a book called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, as well as an exhibition. But it's really important for me to share, whenever I'm sharing about this work, that the project actually begins very intimately. It begins in my home. It begins in the community where I grew up in Southwest Ohio, and with a set of images of my incarcerated loved ones. Over the course of my adult life, I have traveled back and forth to Ohio from wherever I'm living, whether I'm in graduate school at Stanford or now living in New York, to visit relatives who are in prison, most of them having gone in as teenagers, most of them young Black men, also boys and young men I went to high school with, ending up in prisons, and just really thinking about the toll that mass incarceration has had on a working class and relatively small community in Southwest Ohio. And it really crystallized a critique that many scholars of prisons and carceral studies have made very clear, that mass incarceration is not about some equal distribution of imprisonment. It's the hyper incarceration of specific populations in the specific neighborhoods. And though I grew up in a town that's overwhelmingly working class and white, most of the jail and prison population in Southwest Ohio came from the community of the Second Ward that I grew up in Southwest Ohio, including my cousins, Alan and DeAndre, who spent time in prison. Once I finished graduate school and started working on academic articles and writing books, I grew more and more discomforted with how my academic life felt so separate from my family life and my personal life, and how even these visits to see incarcerated relatives felt like, and not that I intended it to be a kind of secret life or a hidden life or a life that had some shame attached to it, but I realized that on a kind of unconscious level, I was carrying around a sense of shame, and a sense of having to keep very close to me the fact that I come from a community and a family that's deeply impacted by incarceration. And so about 10 years ago, I started this project where I just first began just publicly displaying these images of, for example, here you see me with my cousin Alan and my aunt Sharon, visiting Alan during, while he was in prison. Alan now has been released, but when he was 18, he was sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. After a while of, going on these annual or semi-annual visits and amassing these photographs, this kind of collection of images from these visits, I started to see them quite differently than just these images that were about the pain and shame that is attached to incarceration. And I also started to see them as images that went way beyond my own family, that these were images that were probably very similar to images in many albums across the country, given just the mass amount of people who were in prison, the over 2 million people in prison, and the over 100 million people who know someone who've been in prison, or know someone who's currently in prison. So I just started thinking about the kind of sheer scale of these works and what these works were documenting about contemporary life, contemporary culture, and the relationship between culture and politics, and culture and racial capitalism, and culture and punitive governance. And I started also thinking more about the role of people like my Aunt Sharon, who's in this image, and all she had done over Alan's 21 years in prison to sustain him, to keep him attached to family, how she, no matter where he was warehoused, she would take these weekly visits. Saturday morning was her morning that she would drive these rural roads in Ohio to go visit her son. She would bring money to load up on his commissary book. She, would often bring friends or relatives of other incarcerated people. She would emotionally prepare herself for these visits. Often her daughter, my cousin Cassandra, would go with her. And so I just started thinking more and more about the emotional labor and care and time that she had put into maintaining this relationship and really sustaining Alan during those 21 years, and how her work is so similar to the work that Black women have done for centuries to maintain family, community, relationships with loved ones, and to really enact a vision, a practice of a world that is more viable, a world that we can envision to live in, a world that we're not living in. And so for me, abolition actually starts very much in my own home. It starts with seeing the type of love and care that the women of a generation ahead of me put into resisting what mass incarceration does, which is, in radical ways, disorient and destabilize the most intimate relationships, rip people away from what's most familiar with them, and disrupt one's sense of belonging, one's sense of viability, of relevance. And so these practices that were so labor intensive and also so quotidian really became for me the method that I went about doing the research for this project. And these images of my family members in prison posing with loved ones just sustained me over the 10 years of doing this research. And as I did more and more of this research, and right now I'm just showing you a few of the images of me with relatives during visits to Alan and DeAndre over their years of imprisonment. But by, really paying attention to these images and sharing them with a larger public, I learned about, other projects by Black women and non-white women that were about creating this vision of abolition, and a vision of abolition that really starts with intimacy and love and care, and a type of sociality that has been criminalized and throughout our centuries-long experience of subjugation and captivity in the Americas. And through this work, I connected with the work of Dina Lawson, who's a contemporary Black photographer, and did a series called Mohawk Correctional Facility, Jasmine and Family. And these are similar images to the ones I showed you of my incarcerated relatives. They're of Dina's cousin Jasmine during a prison stint that her partner Eric served over a 3-year period, and documenting their family through, again, this kind of not only a carceral landscape, but just the structure of penality and a carceral gaze. So with these images that take place in prison visiting rooms, you often have a guard standing very close by. The photographer who takes the picture is also an incarcerated person whose job is to take the picture while in prison. And then the backdrop itself is also painted by incarcerated people. So just thinking really broadly about the kind of visual culture practices that are taking place in prison, and how these images in many ways counter a much more spectacular visual repertoire that we see in dominant public media about incarcerated people and their loved ones, that are often not nearly as intimate and what I would say quotidian, as everyday as these types of images. And so in doing this research and thinking about this contemporary archive of vernacular photographs, the ones that Dina Lawson has collected of her cousin Jasmine and Jasmine's family, the ones that I've collected of my family and loved ones, I went back and started to do a deep dive into a history of Black radical imaginings that very much connect to a vision of ending prison. And of course, that work brings me to Angela Davis, who is definitely one of the thinkers and activists and just ethical beings that resonate throughout my project and inspire the work that I'm doing. And so I thought about the work of artists like Elizabeth Catlett to create artwork during Angela Davis's time in prison, and using that artwork as part of an effort to raise funds to support Angela Davis's legal defense fund. So Elizabeth Catlett was already an established Black female artist. She was known for her leftist leanings, her political leanings. She had spent time in Mexico with radical artists and activists there. And in 1972, she created this series, Angela Libre, as part of Angela's defense campaign, as well as the work of Faith Ringgold, also around the same time. Faith Ringgold was part of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, and that was an organization that formed here in New York City to protest the Met Museum's Harlem on My Mind racist exhibition of Harlem that was much more about reproducing anthropological tropes of Black people. It was an exhibition that actually did not include Black artists. It was through largely a white photographic lens of Black people as other. So the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition organized to boycott that exhibition, and then launched a larger campaign against anti-Blackness in museums, and moved from protesting museums to collaborating with incarcerated people. And they saw this correlation, this connection between what was happening in museums, the kind of valuation system in museums that excluded Black people, and the populating of Black people in prisons and jails and sites of captivity. And so they created a organization that was based on doing artistic and cultural exchanges with incarcerated people, first in New York, and then it expanded across the country. One of their first charges was to respond to the Attica uprising and to create a series of artworks, including an amazing book called the Attica Book that was inspired by the fearlessness and the collaborative efforts of imprisoned people in Attica to fight for their rights. And Faith Ringgold's contribution to this work was United States of Attica, 1971 to 1972, which was about the uprising, and not just uprising, but the loss of the violent loss of life, the violent killing of protesters by the state, and connecting the specificity of Attica to a much longer history of dispossession and captivity. I think this map, the United States of Attica, really is emblematic of what Kelly Lytle Hernandez, the historian and author of City of Inmates, says about what mass incarceration is. So Kelly Lytle Hernandez looks at mass incarceration as this centuries-long project, as a project that's connected to the settler nation state, and said that mass incarceration is mass elimination. And this map and all of the kind of ways that this map is annotated very much is evidence of that centuries-long history. And of course, this work on visualizing abolition from Black feminist perspectives goes back even earlier. I'm talking about the work of my family. I'm talking about the work of Black radicals in the 60s and 70s, part of the Black Power movement and the Black arts movement. But of course, there's a much longer history, and that history is the history of captivity. What I like to say is that as long as people have been held captive, people have been making art about freedom. People have been envisioning freedom. One incredible example of that type of visualizing work and is the work of Sojourner Truth, who was, a Black abolitionist and suffragist of the 19th century, who was very aware of image and the power of representation, especially the power of self-representation. And so would use this image, this carte de visite, and to fundraise to support the many causes that she would go around the country speaking about. And so one of her most well-known speeches is Ain't I a Woman? Ain't I a Woman? Sojourner's Truth about the specificity of racism and sexism that Black women endure is a speech and a speech and a kind of framework, an intersectional framework that has inspired Black women since she delivered this speech in 1851. And one of the most powerful examples of kind of reanimating that speech is the work of Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, AKA Isis the Savior, who's a formerly incarcerated artist, someone that I've been in deep dialogue with for the past 4 to 5 years, who is a featured artist in the book and the exhibition, and created this incredible 15-minute video triptych called Ain't I a Woman in 2018. And I want to show a clip of that right now. And I think Hope or one of the tech people will help me with that clip. And then I'll come back to my slides and talk to you more about what's happening in that video clip. So are we able to do that right now?
Hi, yeah, we're bringing on the video clip right now.
Okay. Would you like me to stop sharing, Mike?
You can leave yours up, it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Rally the beats.
Yeah. It's much more than they can see. None could ever come between a mother's love and the offspring. I mean, they had me up to the bed for 43 hours. I had to squat and cough, strip naked. Look, I know they mad we made it. Let me talk some. Yeah. Father know my blessing from heaven. 9 months pregnant, stressing, confined behind the birds of Riverside Corrections. Shackled as we made our exit, greeted by the paramedics. Left leg cuffed to the bed during the C-section. Anesthesiologist apprehensive and fretting. A med student leaves the room quickly.
I just want to make sure you can see. Can you see the screen, my screen back? Hope, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, we see your screen again now.
Okay, great, thank you. So that's a short clip of Mary's 15-minute video about her experience in prison in Pennsylvania while she was in labor and shackled for 43 hours while giving birth to her son. And it's a really powerful video that is on view currently at MoMA PS1. It's also something you can access on YouTube if you want to see the video in its entirety. Mary is also a public speaker, and I encourage Barnard to bring her to campus virtually or in person to talk about her work. But what I want to say about it is that the video is very much flows as personal narrative. It's about the specificity of her experience in labor, being shackled while giving birth, and the senselessness of being shackled while in labor, but how that actual physical form of torture is a way of connecting her body to a long history of Black subjugation and forced control over Black women's reproduction, which again then ties her work even more closely to the work of Sojourner Truth in this long duration of Black women's subjugation, but also Black women's visions of freedom. Mary ends the video kind of post-release, also talking about how carcerality or other forms of state punishment, anti-Blackness cannot separate her, cannot break the bonds between her and her child, and also kind of imagining another type of sociality and another type of intimacy that starts with understanding the long history of also prisons, which she says this is not a school to prison pipeline, this is a prison to prison pipeline. And she traces the history of imprisonment to the history of captivity on the shores of Africa. And so thinking about, again, this very a longue durée in terms of Black subjugation and what we're up against as we not only create, but enact in everyday ways, in micro and macro ways, abolition. Mary's work connects very much to this history of also artists, activists, and scholars thinking about how Black women, what Black women endure in prisons and in forms of captivity. For example, this is an archival photograph of Callie Brown that appears in my book. She was incarcerated in Arkansas State Penitentiary. The date of this photograph is unknown, but the historian, the documentarian who came across this image, Bruce Jackson, thinks it's from the 30s and 40s. And the reason that I bring up this photograph is because it's endemic of what many Black women historically and in the present have endured during imprisonment, which is even more heightened forms of punishment, of surveillance, the more likelihood of being thrown in solitary confinement than other groups of people. And in this case, the Callie Brown, the number that she has affixed to her body, which is literally a stigma, it's her prison ID number, is a number that actually is different than all the numbers that white women were wearing. So Bruce Jackson deduces that she was actually incarcerated and housed in a prison with men, which historians like Sarah Haley have documented Black women often being treated, quote, like men and incarcerated in men's units historically in prisons. Mary has continued to do incredible work since her release from prison. She's based in Philadelphia, but also worked with artist communities across the country. She's curating a series called Chosen Family. So again, thinking about an abolitionist vision of family. It's a sense of family that's nonlinear and that's not based on kinship or heteronormative sexual relations. It's not based on patriarchal structures. It's actually based on the way that carcerality tethers people to criminalization and to forms of marginalization. So Chosen Family is a series of talks that she's curating and moderating, all online, streaming on YouTube, where she's putting people who've been incarcerated and have made art about their incarceration in conversation with each other based on a series of themes. And these are all themes that are really about, symbolically and concretely creating a new world. And part of these projects include Mary collaborating with larger groups of people. And so her Dear Black People, I Love You series, and then Start Loving Black People, I'm going to just show you, I Love You, was part of a work that she did in 2020 that was partly a response to protests against the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. You see Mary standing in the middle in khakis with some of the people that she's been collaborating with in Philadelphia. And I want to also show you a still from a recent project that she did at the African American Museum in Philadelphia for an exhibition called Rendering Justice. It's called The Fall of America, where she's looking at white supremacy and anti-Black violence, and also making an argument about how the not newness of these forms of violence that we see being played out on contemporary TV, but thinking about it again within centuries-long practices. And the fact that the only way that we can work across racial, ethnic, gender differences to enact abolition is to understand this long history of dispossession and violence. Mary is in conversation with another artist who's in the exhibition, Marking Time, Tameca Cole. So Mary does work that is in many ways about sociality, about relationality, It starts with her exploring the relationship between carcerality and reproduction, her literally giving birth while imprisoned. Tameca Cole's work actually starts thinking about Black interiority during prison. So Tameca Cole did a series of collages while she was incarcerated that really had to do with the ways that prisons impact one's psychic life and one's relationship to self. And so Locked in a Dark Calm was a collage that she made in 2016, partly in response to abuses that she was experiencing by prison staff in Alabama. She had very limited materials. She was a member, participated in an education and arts program called Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. And through that organization, she was able to get access to very limited art supplies, largely, graphite pencils and charcoal. And so this is a collage that she did using remnants from magazines and graphite. Another work that also is thinking about the relationship between Black interiority and captivity is Unlocked Rage and Desire. She said that this was really a moment where she was filled with both rage and desire for freedom. She was at this time living in a work release program where she was still in captivity. She was held in prison, but she could actually look out onto freedom. It was literally just a block away. She could see people milling about, and how the difficulty of being held in a cage while seeing people milling about, doing everyday things that she didn't have access to. And Unlocked Rage and Desire was her visualization of that tension that she was holding in her body around that. Tameca was also, during her time in captivity, working on a series of collages that looked at and critiqued anti-Black violence that was taking place out on the streets, everyday kind of experiences of Black people in terms of punitive policing and surveillance. And so this collage came as a response to a series of police killings of Black people. Again, it seems like this is a perennial conversation that we're having, and it's one that she, made a very thoughtful and visually striking commentary on while she was also held in captivity. So throughout my project, I am really interested in this kind of tension between what it means to be held in states of unfreedom, but to also be creating work of art that is about one's envisioning of freedom, and that freedom is through a kind of consciousness of anti-Black violence. It's literally a kind of a collective consciousness that is based in practices of even earlier generations. When we think about consciousness raising of feminist movements and Black power movements of earlier eras, is still a type of practice that takes place among artists and activists and collectives in prison, is to understand their captivity as part of a long history of captivity, and not about their own individual experiences of suffering or being labeled as a societal failure. And with that in mind, I want to kind of end by thinking about collaborative works and the works also of Sable Ely Smith, an artist who has not been held in captivity. She's not been in prison, but her art is in the relationship to captivity. She has spent her entire adult life and most of her childhood with her father in prison. Her father was sentenced to life in prison when she was 10 years old. And so she's become quite well known. She's actually a colleague of yours at Barnard. She teaches at Columbia in the School of Fine Arts, and does a lot of multimedia work about how prisons have fragmented Black intimacy, Black family life, Black sociality. One of her most recent works was a neon sign that we commissioned for the Marking Time exhibition called Landscape 5. She's very much thinking about carceral geographies And you see also a critique of the Blue Lives Matter movement in this work. Someone smashed the policeman's radio, and finally silence, a Black language infinitely, and blue in a decade where it finally means sky. Blue and the sky are motifs that come up throughout the exhibition and throughout what I call carceral aesthetics, which are forms of art making that take place in and around and through carceral structures. These are often art practices that take place in states of unfreedom, but also art made by non-incarcerated artists and activists. That's very much a deep investigation into punitive governance and mass incarceration. And as I said, Szabo's work is inspired by, but is not just about her own experience of her father's incarceration. But this is a work here where she's taken a fragment of a photograph from a visiting room, similar to the photographs that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, and turned it into a large public sculpture that was on display at the Socrates Sculpture Garden in Queens in 2016. And it's called, and here is a list of names. And then on the back of it, it has poetry. Szabo, not only is she a visual artist, she's also a textual artist. And at night, it was really important to her that this sign was elevated, was above the street so that people could see it from the neighboring buildings. And it would also be lit up. More other works of her that deal of Szabo's that deal with issues of fragmentation, where she takes what I call penal matter, and that's the very materials of prison, and use them in the service of art making, is a series of photo collages that are based on these prison visiting room photographs that she's turned into like abstract images. One is called The Body Keeps the Score. You'll see, again, this kind of repetition of the color blue, what I call a carceral blue. It's a type of color that's endemic of late capitalism and the contemporary carceral state in the United States. Blue here, again, in this fixture called Backbend that she made in 2019. This is a sculptural project that is meant to look like the type of tables and stools where people sit to engage their incarcerated loved ones in prison and visiting rooms throughout the country. And then again, another public art project that involves neon. It's Ironwood Land that was on view in 2018, 2019 at the Highline Park in New York City, where she combines the original Hollywood sign, which Hollywood was a neighborhood that was racially segregated. It had a racial covenant that excluded Black people from living there, with Ironwood, which is a prison in the state of California, thinking about the relationship between real estate dispossession and the mass incarceration of certain populations. And then finally, I want to just show you a few collaborative projects that are about collectively envisioning abolition from perspectives of Black women. One is a project that's connected to photo requests from Solitary. It's an ongoing collaboration of artists, activists, and directly impacted people, co-founded by Lori Jo Reynolds, who's an artist and educator in Illinois. And this is the I Am a Mom project, where mothers of people who were held in Supermax prison and solitary confinement were asked to pose in front of a wall of imprisoned people held in punitive isolation. These are people who, for the most part, live alone in cells for 23 to 24 hours a day, and to claim one, their reproductive rights, but also to claim a type of mothering that was non-linear, and also that's not about kinship ties. It's about claiming a kind of mothering of all criminalized people as they stand in front of this board of people who are brought together by sharing this experience of solitary, of solitude, of forced solitude, of punitive isolation. Another collaborative project is by Michelle Daniel and Deborah Willis. Deborah Willis is a very well-known African-American photographer and art historian who collaborated with Michelle Daniel. Michelle is a current graduate student, PhD student at NYU, and a formerly incarcerated person. She spent 23 years in prison, emerged from prison as an artist and a scholar, aspiring scholar. And they created for the Rendering Justice exhibition curated by Jesse Crimes in Philadelphia, a project called Point of Triangulation, Intersections of Identity, where they work with sitters who have been formerly incarcerated and pose them in these various ways in terms of thinking about dress and posture and relationship to carcerality and freedom. And so you see one example is they had various sitters pose for them. And it was important that these images were also life-size so that audiences were engaging with these photographic representations on a scale of body to body. And then I'm going to close with a couple of works from the Marking Time exhibition. One is Women on the Rise, which is a Black and Latinx collective out of Miami that collaborates with incarcerated young girls and young women in South Florida. And they do various projects that have to do with how racialization and gender are encoded in fashion and how fashion becomes something that's highly surveilled and also criminalized. So they did a series with Susan Lee Chun, one of the artists participating, invoking the color of orange as another carceral color, and using hoodies, which is a type of clothing that was forbidden for them to wear during their time in juvenile detention center. And then I want to close with a vision of abolition that extends beyond the gallery spaces or museum spaces, and that take over former sites of terror and violence. And this is Freedom Square in Chicago in 2016. That was in response to an investigative journalism piece about the torture of largely Black incarcerated people in Chicago, a secret detention site in Chicago called Homan Square, where people were brutalized, tortured, and even died. And when the story of Homan Square came out, abolitionists, largely Black and Latinx women, came together and took over that space across the street from Homan Square and turned it into what they called Freedom Square, where they practiced various forms of abolition and collective care and created ongoing community building organizations and artistic practices out of this site that they occupied for the summer of 2016. And so I'm going to end there to make sure that we have time for engagement. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I can't hear you.
We always have that happen. I'm unmuted now, right? I just want to start with an expression of appreciation for this presentation. I have heard you speak before about this work, and every time I learn new things and see new images and have a million thoughts about what you're doing with this work, and it's just very moving and inspiring. So thank you. I want to encourage people who might have questions in the audience to put them in the chat, and those are going to be communicated to me via Magic. And but in the meantime, I will start a conversation with you about some of this work. You know, I've seen some of the images that you showed this evening before. I've seen some in the book and some in other talks that you've given. But one of the questions that I have been very interested in is the way that different media and sort of genres of art making populate your work. And I realize that for many people who are making art in the context of incarceration, it's probably largely accidental in terms of what they have access to in terms of media. When Tameca Cole, for example, where you speak about her making collages, you know, using graphite and magazines, you know, and so on. And so I wanted to ask you, put your art historical hat on a little bit to think about or to talk to us about the way that the different artists whose work you're representing here interact with different forms and different styles of art making, and do they, in your research, did they talk with you about the choices that they were making there, and how do you think about that art historical domain?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question. So what I want to say is, I was concerned about time, and so I went a little shorter. But if there's time during our conversation, Elizabeth, I'm happy to show a longer clip of Mary's video, and I can also show a clip of the Fall of America video too, if that would be of interest to the audience. But yes, form is really important. I was focusing largely in this talk about, I think often abolition sounds like a very immaterial, abstract concept to people. And I wanted to think about it in the most concrete, everyday way as what we do to care for people. And that's why I started off by talking about my family and seeing, especially my Aunt Sharon, the work she was doing was often very quiet and could easily go unnoticed, as I think so much of feminized labor goes unnoticed, things that, people who are assigned to the category of women do all the time, and that it becomes normalized and totally taken for granted. And I think it was the carceral setting that brought it into stark relief for me, that I was like, she was actually stepping out of what she did 6 days a week to step into another reality 1 day a week so that she could stay engaged with her son. Mm-hmm. And what she was doing was definitely, there was a method to it. I would go with her on these visits, and I would see her often stop to make sure she had enough cash to support him, to make sure she had enough gas to get here. There was just a whole series of things that she would do in order to prepare for those visits. And some of it involved money, some of it involved, material items. Some of it involved really emotionally and psychically getting herself ready to enter that space. I mean, knowing that the minute you go into those settings, you're also being highly surveilled. You're searched. Your body is searched. I write a little bit about it in Marking Time, especially Black women when they go to visit incarcerated people, how they are subjected to even cavity searches. Their bodies become this site of inquiry and investigation, and also criminalized, that the body is suspect because you're going to visit an imprisoned person. And I'm getting to your question, but I wanted to say why I focused around abolition, thinking about, again, what happens in terms of these practices of care. And so, because abolition often, especially when I'm talking to students, I mean, this might be a very sophisticated audience who get it off top, but abolition just seems something so abstract and non-material. And it feels like a kind of abandoning, a just getting rid of. And then it's oh, there's this big open space. What is it? And so I wanted to think of it as no, it's actually making things right here and now. So it's the kind of care my Aunt Sharon is doing. And then it's Tameca, with very limited resources, creating the own space for her own desire and psychic inquiries, and for her body to move in space, even if that is space on paper, right? She's still kind of occupying space and moving in space in a way that perhaps she didn't feel, or she couldn't, or didn't feel like she could move inside the cell without being surveilled in certain kinds of ways. And even every time, the book is done, but the conversations with artists continue on. And I was actually just recently talking to Tameca, and she was saying, oh, you don't realize how much I was punished by the length of my hair. She's like, if my hair was too short, if it was too long, and it was, again, a type of gendering of her around her hair. And she said, and this wasn't just happening with, quote, white prison staff. She's like, it was and I told her, I said, it's not in prison. It's not about whether the guard is Black or white. Prisons are racist. So it's all the staff, they're enacting the same kind of racial state violence, no matter like what racial category they occupy. So we were having this conversation about the various strategies that she had to use with limited material to enact her own freedom, even though she was still occupying the state of captivity. So in that way, I am looking at a formal inquiry of what limited access that people have to forms of creation. And I'm specifically interested in visual art, but there's all kinds of forms of creation that incarcerated people are involved in, from making music to writing poetry to memoir. I mean, there's to drama. There's lots of dancing. But I was really interested in the manipulation of material objects, and especially the taking on of state material, using state materials, materials that are meant to tether you and hold you as a captive toward a vision of freedom. So actually, to kind of riff off of Audre Lorde, to actually take the master's tools and to like use it in the service of art making. So in that way, then I got in. It forced me to think about categories of art making in prison. And so I talk about this idea of carceral aesthetics as the production of art under the condition of unfreedom, but also as something broader or more expansive. It's about art making that can take place across the carceral landscape, that involve art collectives and artists who've never been in prison, but who are really deeply concerned about punitive governance and state surveillance and marginalization and criminalization. And so there are various artists who show up in the book and also the exhibition who have not been in prison, but they're doing very similar work from different sites than imprisoned people. And other categories that come up, you were talking about the kind of formalism, is like the idea of penal matter. And so those are the material constraints that people use to make art in prison. I think about penal space, which I think Tameca Cole's collages really, give us a really strong, profound sense of what penal space is. It is the built environment of prison, but it's also about how prisons really structure spatial relationships and intimate relationships, how prisons are about disrupting what people are most familiar with. It's literally eradicating intimacy from people's life and forcing them into close proximity with strangers, right? So it's a kind of forced intimacy with strangers that's also often structured around types of antagonisms that the state reproduce. And then penal time is how, under this quote modern form of governance, people are punished through sentences, through time as a measurement of punishment, and thinking about every second, every millisecond in prison as a measurement, as one's being punished. You're eating in prison, you're being punished. You read a book, you're being punished. That entire experience is a measurement of punishment. So those are the kind of categories that I use to frame, to think about what it means to envision, to plan, to work collectively with other artists and activists while being condemned and punished by the state.
Thank you. We now have some questions that have come in, some of which are asking you to elaborate on the work that you did in this project. You've spoken some already about the way that you connected your family background to the work that you've done with incarcerated women and their art making. But there are questions also about just the practicality of your research. How did you connect with the artists whose work you document here? What was what kinds of relationships did you build with them? How was your collaboration working alongside?
So I'll kind of take like one at a time, just because. So the project again, when I started doing this work, I didn't imagine myself writing a book or doing a series of exhibitions and public programs. I started by dealing with my own reticence around having incarcerated relatives, and realizing that I was unconsciously reproducing a state narrative of bad subject by just having that as a kind of a sectioned off part of my life that seems so separate and distinct from other parts of my life. And so I wanted to activate and figure out how to bring my incarcerated cousins into my everyday life. And so I started to just be more public about the fact that I had incarcerated loved ones. I started hanging those images around my house. I started giving a lot of talks about just those photographs, not knowing where like having no idea where those conversations were going, but like literally going public with like, I love people who are in prison. And that led me to like all kinds of relationships with people where other people would come up to me and share that either they had been in prison, they had been arrested, they had relatives in prison. And so the project really grew from like that kind of word of mouth experience where other people would say, oh, you know, I know someone who made art while they were in prison. My cousin Alan, during his time in prison, actually put me in touch with an artist named Dean Gillespie. And Dean became a real important interlocutor throughout the project for me. I met him in 2014. I'm from Southwest Ohio. An educator in Southwest Ohio had heard about my research. She lived in Cincinnati. She actually drove up to New York in 2017 for an event I was doing there. And she had just read about it in some activist magazine and said, hey, I volunteer at this prison in Ohio. And I know this woman named Tyra Patterson, who at the time was in prison. She became a very good friend of mine. We started writing letters. She's now released. She's a like national figure against long-term incarceration, against wrongful conviction, against this kind of ideology of not releasing people who committed, quote, violent crimes. He has this part of this organization called Beyond Guilt that's not about innocence or guilt, you know. And so it really grew through the more I gave talks, the more it connected me to other artists, activists, scholars, and a lot of relatives of people who were in prison who felt a sense of helplessness about having their loved one in prison, and having their art was a way of, I think, feeling hopeful or feeling like that they could have some type of agency in bringing their incarcerated loved one into the public. So Donna Lotney is the mother of Mark Lotney, who did the cover image of my book. He's still in prison. She's become a really great ally who shares a lot with me and shows up for events. So it really is like creating another sense of community. For me, it's actually working on this project has been also enacting like abolitionist community. I have a community of people who are about as diverse, racially, ethnically, gender-wise, but also politically. These are not all people who align with me politically, but they have come into a consciousness around punitive governance through the experience of either themselves being in prison or someone they love being in prison. So I think that answers some of the questions. I want to say practically, I interviewed over 70 people for the book, and that took place over a 10-year period. I did site visits to various prisons, and those site visits were based on me building relationships with nonprofit organizations and activist collectives that were working often in sites of captivity or working with returning citizens, people who have been released from prison. So they put me in touch with, some prison staff who gave me help to facilitate access to incarcerated people in programs. I've also had people just over the course of the years hear about the work and reach out to me. Like, for example, Emil DeWeaver, who's formerly incarcerated. He's out now, but he started a nonprofit organization when he was in prison in San Quentin called Prison Renaissance. It's collaboratively with some other people in prison. And he had heard about my work and just had an ally, a non-incarcerated ally, write me, or what he calls a free world ally, saying, hey, I want to interview you for this magazine I'm doing. So it really, it's not unidirectional. It becomes very much like this network. As the project grew, more and more people were reaching out to me from, various and various sites. I've had people write me from solitary confinement, and often the art I've learned about has been through incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people saying, oh, you should know about this person, you should be in touch with this person. And so like that kind of generosity helping to grow the project.
Great. I had been thinking about this question, not quite in the way that one of the audience members has framed it, but I was thinking about the different locations from which the work that you presented to us comes. And this audience member has asked, how do you feel that regionality, that is the location where people are incarcerated, affects the artwork that that they produce and their visions for abolition? Are there specificities that you...
I really love this question. And I think for me, that question it feels even more resonant right now because, you know, I spent a lot of time talking about Mary Baxter and Tameca Cole, who are like on my mind right now. I've been in conversation with both of them recently, and Tameca is actually in New York this week, and it's her first time ever in New York. She actually is right now serving lifetime parole. So she can't leave the state of Alabama for the rest of her life without her parole officer giving her permission. It's one of the most kind of egregious like forms of continuing a sentence once someone's been released from prison. She saw the exhibition Marking Time for the first time yesterday and was just kind of blown away. She said so much of the work that she saw in that exhibition was stuff that no one in Alabama could have done without really being punished or held in solitary confinement. So it is very, very regional. And it also has to do, like, you know, the book is like investigating and also critiquing this kind of long relationship between prisons and museums. And museums is this like site evaluation and sites of the reproduction of a type of whiteness, and prisons as this, you know, site of captivity, of marginalization, of incapacitating and just eradicating certain populations, right? But they're parallel institutions, and they work in tandem. And I say that to say that a lot of prisons where you see super robust, innovative art programs are prisons that are close to metropoles, like prisons that are close to San Francisco or prisons that are close to New York City, where you have an influx of artists who are resourced, who often are interested in, quote, ideas of like outsider art or counterculture. I mean, sometimes they might be interested in going into these sites for spectacular reasons. Sometimes it might be for political reasons. But it does, without fail, the prisons that seem to have more robust art programs are prisons that are not far from art metropoles, or prisons that are in states that have just more resourced funds for art and education and cultural programming writ broadly. But that doesn't mean that there aren't really interesting practices taking place in places like, for example, the state of Louisiana, which has one of the harshest state prison systems with some of the longest sentences, where historically parole was just a pie in the sky, like no one ever got parole. So if you got a life sentence in Louisiana, more than likely you're gonna die there. That's like the history of prisons in Louisiana. But Louisiana also has this really robust, incredible history of various forms of art making in prisons. And even in a prison like Angola, which is a prison that's the largest maximum security prison in the world, that's built on a former slave plantation, that is a site of centuries-long violence against Black people and Indigenous people and queer people, and just a history of horror and terror. It also has this history of like just really radical and interesting art and politics. It's the site where the Angola 3 formed, and they created a Black Panther Party in prison. So I don't want to privilege like, quote, liberal art centers over these other places, other places where you might find really interesting radical art practices. In the Southwest, there's a history of paños, which are largely like kind of textile, like mural-based textile art that's very popular among Chicano incarcerated people. And that speaks to a longer tradition of a type of art like that uses kind of religious and vernacular images And that's very robust. In the Dakotas, you see, various forms of art making that really are about reanimating indigenous art practices. Leonard Peltier, who is a AIM member, American Indian Movement, incarcerated person, has been in prison since the mid 70s, is a very well-known portrait artist who's been making art in prison for over 3 decades. So and as he's moved around the federal prison system. So even though you do find some sites with more established art programs, you find people doing radical and innovative practices, often in some of the less resourced places, because people become, in some ways, more innovative with scarcity. There's an artist named Todd Tarselli who's in the exhibition, who has spent many years in solitary confinement, partly because he's become quite politicized and radical in his thinking, and that if seen as a threat to the operations of the prison staff. So they hold people who have come into a radical consciousness, often in solitary confinement. And during his time in solitary confinement, he paints on leaves that he picks up from the prison yard. So very, very little material, but he still finds ways of innovating. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And just to circle back to the other piece of this question, which is, are there different specificities around ideas about abolition in these different locations?
That was definitely, and I love that part of the question. Yeah. And I actually really appreciate that question, because as I've been in conversation longer and longer with people who've been directly impacted, I've gotten different answers from them. And I do want to share, can I share a link? If I share a link in this chat, can you share it with the audience? Because it is to a conversation that I had with 4 different artists in the exhibition, and it was about what abolition means to them. And it was so inspiring for me to hear the really nuanced and various iterations that people had on. So I shared it. It was published as a podcast in a magazine article for MoMA magazine.
Yeah, it looks like Hope is going to be able to share it for us in just a second.
Okay, great, thank you. I would love for you to, because I as I was conducting the interviews, I was so inspired, and just kind of it was formative in terms of my own thinking. But what I want to say is that for a lot of people who've been in prison, that part of criminalization and incarceration is the burden of shame. It's kind of a psychic relationship to being, quote, a bad subject, being labeled by the state and often publicly shamed and humiliated, that many of the artists that I've talked to have had their own struggle with that. So it's hard for them, in fact, there's coming to a place where they might say they're an abolitionist is a whole series of processes where they're dealing with the fact whether they've caused harm to someone or not, which people are in prisons for various reasons. And often we don't think about the harm of under-resourced communities and, kind of systemic violence, but like coming in relationship and understanding of whatever brought them to prison, and that relationship to like systemic structures or systemic failures. And seeing people in prison who might be in very bad conditions, or who might not know how to interact with other people because they've been so stripped of sociality. So for example, people in solitary confinement, often if you're in long-term confinement, it's hard to return to general population because you've experienced such psychic damage and sometimes such sensory damage that it's hard to even be touched or to hear really loud noises because you've been tortured, right? And so then what kind of systems of care, what kind of institutions of support will allow the healing of people like that so that harm is not inevitable, right? So these are questions that I hear people who've been in prison asking from having spent time in sites of captivity. And I think for me, they're really, really, really great questions, because it really is about the kind of the labor, the actual like building of systems that, you know, again, in terms of like, we're not thinking abstractly, we're thinking really, really concretely. What do you do with someone who's suffering from PTSD? And the way the prison manages it is to just lock them away and try to muffle their screams, right? And so those are some questions that people have been taught, you know, that I hear when I talk to people who are directly impacted. And then an artist who is in the show who was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 17, a sentence that's now ruled unconstitutional, but was, you know, is thinking about how people who have been arrested and convicted for, quote, for acts of violence or causing harm against other people, how they really need to be at the table in conversations around transformative justice, around harm reduction, and around abolition. That you can't really have those conversations if you're not talking to people who have caused harm and who are therefore going through their own forms of healing as someone who's done harm. Like when you harm someone, you've also caused harm to yourself, because you've broken your own kind of relationship to a kind of social contract, a relationship to like sociality and intimacy. And asking these questions, thinking through these questions.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions that have come in that are reflecting on particular things that you mentioned in your talk, and about how those relate to the lived experience of people who are incarcerated. One of these is, could you say a little bit more about Black women being treated as men in carceral settings? This person writes, I work a lot with trans women in prisons and feel they're often gendered differently based on their race and color.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there was a report that came out in, it's like COVID. I really get like messed up with COVID years, but I think it was in 2019 that was looking at, you know, first of all, I like think we have to trouble like the idea of men's prisons and women's prisons, and we know that those are problematic categories, and that the way that the state assigns gender to incarcerated people is incredibly problematic. And I've learned more and more that that's also the case of how race gets assigned. That if you look at like the state assignation of race, it's different than how people often racially identify, especially for Afro-Latinos. So I just want to say that these categories are really fraught, and they're used by prisons to enforce gender and racial apartheid. So they're used as categories of violence to also create antagonistic and often vulnerable relations inside prisons that make it easier for the staff to maintain power over. These are categories in terms that are about a hierarchy of dominance, and that allows the state to continue to make certain populations vulnerable. And so that plays out most viciously with the rates of isolation of trans Black women, who have the highest rates of being put in solitary confinement. So this study that was about women's prisons, that's why I was like, I want to start off by saying it's problematic, like the category of men and women's prison, but that women's prisons often have higher levels of tickets, and tickets are disciplinary infractions. Women's prisons, generally there are less incidents of, quote, physical violence, or violence that's like about like between two people. The violence that's often recorded in women's prisons are violence from staff, like towards incarcerated people, or violence on one's body, self-harm. But these tickets are often around attitudinal judgments that guards are making against people, quote, rolling their eyes or kissing their teeth, and largely targeting Black women. And that these tickets are not just like, again, abstract things, that they impact your ability to call home and talk to your children, your ability to accept visitors, your ability to participate in programs, your ability to get early release, your ability to have a lower security status. Like, these really have an impact on one's, what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, premature death. You know, that these tickets actually accumulate and make one more vulnerable and susceptible to premature death. And so that plays out throughout prisons. And then if you look just more at the history of like reformers and folks writing, researchers writing about prisons, often they will talk about relationships, sexual intimacy and social intimacies in prisons that are taking place often across racial and gender lines by turning Black women into like the man, like thinking about a very top-down, penetrative, phallic idea of relationships among women, and only understanding it through the logic of penetration and dominance.
Thank you. We just have a couple minutes left. I want to use the privilege of the chair here to ask a final question. Your work going forward. I know you've done this huge project that took 10 years to research and write, and now you have an exhibit at MoMA, and and you're talking about it in various places. Are you going to continue working in this?
Yeah, I like it. Thank you. So thank you. So we're working right now to travel the exhibition. The exhibition closes on April 4th. So anyone in the New York area, please come out and see it. It's at MoMA PS1. So hopefully the traveling exhibition will, be going across country for the next 3 to 5 years. And then I co-edited a special issue of Feminist Formations with during my time at the Institute for Research on Women. I directed the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers from 2013 to 2016. And collaborated with my colleague there, Sarah Tobias, on a special issue of Feminist Formations that's coming out next month in April. And it's called The New Status Quo. And it's looking at poverty, gender, and sexuality in the 21st century, and thinking about it also in relationship to like the current pandemic. So we're going to do a release event of that that involves some of the contributors in early May. And so those are the kind of immediate things that I'm working on. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This was really a wonderful presentation, and then the questions were great and got you to talk some more, which was wonderful. And it's just been really delightful to have you with us. I wish we were in person so that we could now have a proper reception and talk some more, but alas, we're in the virtual world. So
well, I really appreciate having me, and the questions were great. I love having these kind of dialogues. They're fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think that Hope is going to wrap us up, and then maybe we'll just stay on for a minute to
Okay, sounds good. I'm here.
Okay.